Okay, so we are continuing with Maamar in the Pachad on Shabbos. We are dedicating this learning session Lilei Neshamat
Mordechai Yisrael Tzvi.
Mordechai Yisrael Tzvi.
Ben Moshe Alshech.
Your saintly father-in-law.
Exactly. This is your side this month.
Wow, that's crazy. So one more time, Mordechai Yisrael Tzvi.
Ben Moshe Ara.
Ben Moshe Ara. Wow. Okay. Shalom Zohab Aliyah.
Amen.
Okay.
It was one of his favorite books.
I was going to say, you get a kick out of knowing that we're doing this for him. Okay. So we talked about a bunch of things on Sunday. We talked about how we say that Shamar v'Zachar b'dibur echad nemru, that both the Shamar, you should safeguard the Shabbos, and the Zachar, you should keep it, celebrate it, remember it, or the positive and the negative commandments of Shabbos, and they were both set together, and therefore the implications are that even though normally a woman is not obligated to keep time-bound positive mitzvahs, only the negative-bound mitzvahs, since the Zachar and Shamar of Shabbos were given together, anybody who is commanded on the negative is also commanded on the positive. So an example would be that a woman has the same obligation to make Kiddush on Shabbos that her husband does. That would not necessarily be so for Shabbat. For Yom Tov. Anyway, so Zachar and Shamar are together, and we also said that we mentioned that the Ramban said that the negative commandments are done with awe, and the positive commandments are done with love. And love and fear are expressed by Zachar and Shamar. So the Pachad Yitzchok wanted to say that on Shabbos you don't have a negative mitzvah, a prohibition of Shabbos that doesn't have both, not just fear in it or awe, but also love. Just like you don't have a positive way of positive mitzvah of Shabbos that doesn't have both awe and fear. And then he mentioned that when he talked about this in Shar Chodesh Aviv, people gave him a hard time. And they said, how can you taste what we call a kum ve'aseh, the feeling of the urgency or to take initiative to do something, which is what you're supposed to feel in the expansion of ahava in regards to a positive mitzvah. Where do you feel that? In the shev ve'al taseh, to sit and to abstain from action, which is the attitude to have in terms of to not doing that which is forbidden to do on Shabbos from a function of yirah. So that's kind of that's just a. This was all, we discussed this in the context of what kicked off the Maamar. The question we have is that in the Shabbos davening, we have two mentions of an appeal for God to be, to accept our Shabbos with desire. Right? That's how we started off. We said that in the Shabbos davening, we say both, Ritzei na b'mnuchatenu, that God should be desirous of our rest on Shabbos, and we end off the bracha, right? V'hanchilenu b'ratzon Shabbos kadshecha, and that God should bequeath to us with desire His Shabbos. He should share the sanctity of His Shabbos with us with desire. So we asked, why repeat the two? And also we said, we noted a contrast that the first one is specifically an aspect of Shabbos that we're asking that God be desirous of, and that is our rest, that which we abstain from. Meaning not the things that we do positively, but the things we do negatively. And so we asked also, why do we single that out? And then in the second mention in the davening, we say, V'anchilenu b'ratzon Shabbos kadshecha, that seems to be a general, inclusive, overall statement of Shabbos that we ask God to share with us in a desirous way. Okay, so that's what we were talking about. We will continue with Gimel. Okay, B'kama dinei haTorah matzinu tanai shel ma'aseh dafka. There are several bodies of halachot, mitzvot, categories of things, different examples of this following category of thing that we say that it is reliant on a physical act. What do I mean? For example, any prohibition in the Torah that if they would do on purpose with witnesses and a warning from Bet Din, if they do it on purpose, and the punishment in the Torah for such a thing is death by Sanhedrin. So if they do it by first of all, if they can't be adjudicated in court, meaning they were not warned and Beis Din does not have the jurisdiction, given the circumstances, to punish them, so they get a punishment bidei shamayim. Anything that would be the death penalty or capital punishment from Beit Din is kares bidei shamayim. Anybody who does something that the Isser is karet, if he does it b'shogeg, he does by accident, so he's required to bring a karban chatas. Now, a karban chatas, a sin offering, can only be brought on a prohibition that was done with an action. If it's a prohibition that there's no action, you cannot bring a chatas.
If it's a negative prohibition, then there's
many negative prohibitions that don't involve actions.
Right.
You can't say certain things. You can't think certain things.
There's no chatat on a negative prohibition, basically.
What do you mean? There's a chatas on a negative prohibition that only the negative prohibitions that if you would do them, you would get karet. Here, I'll say it again, but they need a maisa. So there's many negative prohibitions that don't have a maisa, in which case when you do them, you can't bring a karban chatas. Here, let's do it inside. Okay. The Torah. In several of the halachos of the Torah, matzinu tenai shel maisa dafka, we see that specifically what is required in those examples is a condition of action. Just like we find in the obligation of bringing a karban chatas, a sin offering, if in the sin that the person is bringing, the sin that the person did, if there's no ma'aseh, if there was no action, you can't bring a chatas. Let's say a person didn't know that you can't curse, you can't say certain things publicly with Shem Hashem, right? And he does them. He doesn't have, so even though it's b'shogeg, he can't bring a karban because that is a dibur, and that's not halachically considered a ma'aseh. Those are words and not actions. So that's a prohibition that since there's no action, you can't bring a karban chatas because the karban chatas, the sin offering, is reliant on there being an action. Okay? Yotzei min hakal hazeh hu isur dia arayot. The exception to this case is the forbidden sexual relationships. Al isuri arayot ne'amar b'Torah v'nichrasu ha'nafashos ha'osos. The Torah specifically says, in regards to somebody who violates those prohibitions, it says that v'nichrasu, that they will be excised, ha'nafashot ha'osot, the souls that did. Afapi she'iyah lo avda maisa, even though they did not do an action. What does that mean? So the Chazal explains, she'amru dehana kriya rachmana maisa. Okay, let's say somebody did not do anything; he was passive. Somebody engaged in a forbidden sexual relationship or forbidden sexual act, but they were passive in it. They didn't do an act. So since the verse says specifically over there, not only that, but the souls that do, you would think that unless they do an act, it would not be considered a violation. So Chazal say that no, over here, even if you're passive, it would still be considered an act. Why? Because hana'ah, pleasure, the Torah considers an act. Meaning if you do something, you allow yourself something, then you experience pleasure from it, that pleasure already is on the level of reality of you doing a physical act. And the Pachad Yitzchok says we've never found an example like this at all mentioned in the Torah at all. Didafka ba'arayot, only specifically by the forbidden sexual relationships. Amru, Chazal said, the hanach hashiva maisa, that we consider for the violating of this prohibition, we consider the hana, the pleasure experienced, as enough of a maisa to obligate. Meaning it was a maisa, and therefore, if a person did it by accident, they could bring a karban chatas. Okay, but we don't see that the Torah considers pleasure as on the level of action anywhere else. Now, as baras yichud inyan zel arayat dafka, and the explanation for why this phenomenon would appear specifically by the forbidden relationships, hu mahalach amok. It's a very, very deep path to explain this. He's going to attempt somewhat. So Chazal say, Hayom la'asotam, u'machar lakabel schara. This world is a world where you do actions, and The coming world is a world to receive the reward for those actions. Olam Hazeh is a place to do the mitzvahs. You cannot receive the benefit of that which you are achieving here in this world. This world can't maintain that. Schar mitzvah b'hai amaleka, that there is no real reward, the essential reward for a mitzvah is not in this world. And therefore, hayom la'asotam, today to do them, ulamachar, and tomorrow, meaning olam haba, l'kabel scharam, to receive that schar, which seems to say that that the actions, the locus of action, is reserved for this world, and the pleasure, true pleasure, that you would get for the schar of your mitzvahs is in the next world. נתחלק בכאן על המחר מן היום, שכן יתייחד המחר לקבלת שכר של עונג, ונתייחד היום לטרחה של השתדלות. So in that phrase of the Chachamim, they have assigned to the today, meaning the being, the dimension that we exist in now, for doing action, and we separate action from the pleasure of receiving the reward in the next world. So it's very strange. First, remember, we just made a statement that regarding the arayot, that's an example where the Torah equates both pleasure and action. It's saying that the pleasure itself is action. Right. Okay? And now so he's taking a step back and he's saying, really, you have to understand that the way Chazal describe it to us, these things are separated. They're contrasted, that you have the domain of today, which is action, and the domain of tomorrow, which is the pleasure. Okay? So, okay. Nitchalek bekan. Here, in this phrase, we separate the machar, quote, the tomorrow, min hayom, from the today. Shekei nityached, and that we have also assigned the machar, the tomorrow, the kabbalat schar shel oneg, to the receiving of reward, which we call oneg, pleasure. V'nityached ha'hayom, and we have singled out the today, litircha shel hishtadlus, to the labor of work. Okay? V'nimtza lanu od chilek ben halamachar ben ha'hayom. And it can be found also another distinction between the tomorrow and the today. Sheha'hayom, that the today of that statement, hu olam over. That is a passing dimension. It's a transient world. V'halamachar, and the tomorrow that we're talking about, hu olam kayam. That is an eternal world. Because all the future that is to come at the end of the today is considered tomorrow. Meaning when it says machar, it means meaning the reality at the end of this reality. Meaning it implies that this reality, the hayom, ends, whereas machar doesn't end. So he's showing you that there's also contrast here between temporal and eternal. Okay. So through this we can say, Ki olam hamasa hu olam over. This world, the world of action, is a temporal world. Shekein la'asotam, and it's just an opportunity for action. Eino tofes ela hayom. So the real action can only be in this world of the passing transient world. And in contrast to this, olam hataynon, pleasure, hu olam kayam, that is an eternal world. So it's like this is a world, our world is a temporal world. That means it's a world of a medium that functions as to provide for flux, change. So it's a medium for action. Yeah. However, the other world is a world for us to exist in a state. So by definition, ideally, it shouldn't change, right? What's the state? Pleasure. That's the state we're supposed to be in. When we're not, how do we achieve that? By being in a temporal dimension that allows for change. That allowing for change facilitates, it's a medium for us to be able to do actions, right? So it doesn't make sense that the temporal place would be the ideal place for us to retain a state. Meaning it seems perfectly suited, right? The hayom is suited for action, and the machar is suited for oneg.
So it's a question on how can you say that the pleasure of arayot is a
it would be considered halachically a ma'isa, right? Okay, okay. So, because we assigned, remember we said that schar, the receiving of the reward, which is the pleasure that we're talking about, the ultimate pleasure, that is only possible in the medium of the tomorrow, what we alluded to as the tomorrow. All this is true when we're talking about absolutes. In a perfect world, where we're talking objectively about the contrast between this world and the next world. But there's a whole range, it's a continuum of of overlapping realities. Meaning you can
Between
taste,
this world and the next world.
yeah, meaning we're remember Shabbos itself, we said we're
Chelik.
borrowing from an eternal domain somehow that travels to us in time and space, right? So that description that we quoted was just to establish a baseline, an objective understanding of the nature of these two domains and the separation between action and reward. Okay, aval lekushta de milsa, but in truth of the matter, yesh makom letiburim halalu gam b'derech haluka yachasit. You can also say this relatively speaking. ובדרך חלוקה יחסית נאמר כך, כל מה שהינך מתקרב יותר לתחומו של הנצח הקיים. So he wants to make a formulation here. He's saying, as much as you continue to approach a domain which is more eternal, meaning you're moving towards eternal, even if you're not in absolute eternity, but you are moving towards eternity, כך בערך זה, so too, with that, according to that quality, hincha holech mitkarev l'rishuto shel ha'ta'anut. You get closer and closer to the domain of pleasure. The klalahu, the rule is olam hanetzach hu olam ha'tanuk. Just bear in mind that the eternal world is a world of ta'anuk. Ta'anuk is a word in Lashon HaKodesh describing greatest pleasure. I'm not sure if it's going to be in this essay, but in one of these essays he describes beautifully what oneg really is. Specifically why we talk about Shabbos as a place of oneg, or a time of oneg. Okay, so v'hine mikol hamon pu'ulatav v'drachav shel ha'olam ha'over. In all its actions and ways, the nature of the world, of a passing world, a transient world, ha'pu'ula hayoter mitkarevet l'tchuma shel ha'netzach ha'kayam, when you have an action that approaches more the boundaries or the borders of an eternal reality, he po'elet, in the world, in the physical world here, where everything is transient, where you get the closest to eternity in a physical transient world, he pulat haholada. That is the action or the phenomenon of birthing, of bringing forth.
Birthing.
Yeah, bringing forth something new, a new generation. Sheharei raka yedei pulat haholada, because it's only through this procreation and perpetuation that mitkayemeti nitzchioto shel amin can you establish the eternity, not eternality, but the sustaining of the species, o shel ish, or of the individual. Meaning, in a physical world where everything is temporal, how do we get around that? How do we maintain our standing here, that we should be a constant here? Through that process of generation of the human species, which is basically procreation.
Even though that child is eventually going to die as well.
Meaning everything in this world is temporal. And yet, in the grand scheme of things, how we go around it, or at least we survive in this world to maintain our presence till we get to eternality, is through this. So the closest you get to that, or this somehow is a bridge, or like some sort of interface, so to speak, this phenomenon that allows for us to touch or approach eternality.
It's also the closest we can get to creation of God, the God's creation.
Okay.
Yes, would you agree?
In a certain way, there are statements that are supportive of that. I would not say that absolutely, but I'm not sure as to the relevance of that here. Because remember, right now we're trying to parse out the difference in domain between...
Well, the relevance is that God creates the world, and it's that transition between the next world and this world. And he uses that creation. The closest we can get to emulating that is giving birth, which is also as close
But I'm not sure why what that has to do with what we're talking about. Why are we talking about birth at all?
Because you said it's a chelik lo olam haba almost.
No, what we're saying is that even though we can talk in absolutes, but there's relativism. And in this world, remember, we're trying to find an element that somehow has a taste or a touch of eternality. It allows us to touch something that's not bound by time, right, within time. You're noting a true phenomena. I'm just not sure what its relevance is directly here to this point, right? But we're saying here, meaning why is having children relevant here? Because it's what allows us to be beyond, even though we come with an expiration date, it allows us to stick around, okay? So now, Asher al-Kain, and therefore, mitkarevet hi pu'ulat ha'holada l'tchuma shel ha'netzach. It's what actually takes us closer this phenomenon in the world of birthing brings us closer to eternity. It doesn't make us eternal, but it brings us closer to that idea of eternity. Ad kedei kach, to the degree shehi nechneset lagamri b'tchum sheltona shel ha'ana, to the degree that there is a huge overlap between the issues that go into what's necessary to birth and issues of pleasure.
What?
Issues of pleasure.
What's the link between birth and pleasure?
You cannot have birth without some sort of sexual act.
Oh.
And you can't separate the issues of sexual acts and pleasure to the degree where that's why it's like a major thing in the Torah. And we're saying that that's the pleasure in that makes it a Maisa. I mean, he's going to bring it all together. But yeah, so one second. So but don't get ahead because we have to get the pieces that we're talking about.
Right. No,
Yeah.
I just couldn't get the
Yeah, that's why you have to, okay. So once again, okay, we're saying that Hayom la'asota melamacha lekabel schar. There is a domain which is transient, and it is a domain exclusively for action in terms of achieving ultimately a reward, which is only possible in the next domain, which is all about pleasure. So pleasure is eternal, and temporal is doing. So that's an absolute statement. But in truth, there are all types of relative concepts, and the Pachad Yitzchok is pointing out that one of the closest things, or where you have embodied in this world and in the ways that this world functions, an approach to, or something that connects us to eternity, or is like a me'ain of eternity here, or allows human species to experience a me'ain of eternity, that is the ability to regenerate. Mm-hmm. And that's tied in with pleasure. The klalahu, because here's the rule, sheltona shel koach hatanug, the dominion of the power of pleasure, hu ba'olam hanatzach. That's truly native to the world of eternity. And since in this action of holada, of giving birth, of generating a new generation, you can find, meaning it is an attempt or an approach towards eternity, it is relying, or it is an approach, or it dips into the world of eternity, which is ruled by pleasure.
But it's suggesting that all pleasure is part of eternity, and that's not right. Surely there's physical pleasures that are not part of an eternal world.
Absolutely. So
I don't understand what he's saying.
Yeah, because even if it's true what you're saying, all pleasure, it's true that all pleasure comes from the future world. Okay?
Even physical pleasure.
Meaning physical pleasure is, meaning why should there be pleasure at all in physicality? That's coming from a state that's beyond. Obviously, if we didn't have pleasure, we wouldn't be, meaning in this world, we wouldn't be able to talk about it, we couldn't relate to it, we wouldn't be motivated to it, meaning it's not, like I said, it's not absolute. You have pleasures here. But where does pleasure come from? What is it native to? Where does it come from? And where is its natural domain? That's eternal.
So when I'm eating a cheeseburger or something, right?
Here's the problem. Since you're having something which is a native of an eternal world in a temporal world, it's not real. And therefore you can never really hold on to it. And pursuing it like that is a waste of this world.
Can you say that again? Sorry, I didn't get it.
Okay, the problem is like this. Pleasure does not belong to this world. It doesn't belong in this world. It's possible to access it, but you can never access it in a way that's real because it's not native to this world, so it's always fleeting, it's never really embodied, and therefore a pursuit of that, how pleasure can be in this world, is a complete subversion of your time spent here because you can't really achieve true pleasure. But the pleasure is pleasure, and pleasure comes from the eternal world. It's from the Olam HaNetzach. That in itself is too much of a thing we should dwell on. Yeah.
No, but an animal, for example, who's suckling milk from his mother, that gives him pleasure.
Okay.
Right? And you're saying, how can that be from an eternal world? I'm struggling with the idea.
All pleasure comes from an eternal world.
I'm struggling with that
you relate to
concept.
pleasure as particular acts. You're not thinking about pleasure, on a cosmic level.
I see.
Pleasure is possible in any. Once pleasure exists, pleasure. You think. I don't want to say
the notion of pleasure.
More than that, we've been talking about cosmic pleasure. How cosmic pleasure is all a function of the domain. Its natural place it is even a description of eternity. Yes.
Okay.
Obviously,
is that
we
written
only.
elsewhere? This idea that pleasure comes from eternity.
This is a.
Or is this footless chidush?
I would suggest maybe learn Arizal or Rav Yisrael Saruk, Baal Shem Tov. I think this is, somebody has no idea what true pleasure is if they don't understand what pleasure is spiritually. This is the yesod of the Chachamim. This is, I would say, I don't know where you would find it overtly, but this is, I mean, this is classic Judaism.
Okay. It's the first time I heard of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll tell you what's maybe confusing to you also, which makes things a little complicated. We're borrowing terms. There's hana'ah, which means pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we're talking about hana'ah to talk about oneg. Oneg and hana'ah are not the same thing. Hana'ah is like a sensual pleasure that's possible in this world. Oneg is a much, much higher thing. Now, in another place, which is not here, he talks about how oneg is only possible when your body and your soul are together. You cannot have oneg when you're in a state where your body and soul are separate. So in Gan Eden, which is a place where the neshamot are disembodied from the guf and they wait for Tchiyat HaMetim, they can't have oneg because they don't have a body. And la'atid lavo, Yom Shekula Shabbat, after Tchiyat HaMetim, everybody's going to be in their bodies. That's the ultimate oneg. So he talks about this in another essay, he develops it. But anyway, so like it could be that not directly addressing that could have made things. But I don't believe that this is the place to go into it over here because we're really. It's so hard to make.
So very unusual idea.
Yeah. So what he's saying over here, what you have to know, is that ta'anug is a function, as a great cosmic a thing. The fact that ta'anug at all is possible, that was the whole point of the Bria. And that was the point to give the schar to the tzaddikim, which is the oneg. And the main place for that, the only place that's actually possible is olam haba.
Right.
And you have, so he's saying that even though in an absolute way that's true, you can have all kinds of little hana'ah in this world, which is kind of some sort of traces or whatever, and they're to be found specifically in these places because really the only reason why sexual procreation was put in this world is to approach eternity. So it's going to have, you can taste of that in that. Okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, I would just say that I found many times that I had to learn a Pachad Yitzchok through. You can't understand every point necessarily the first time around. As you're reading, you have to wait for the structure to emerge and go back. And there's many times afterwards that I've thought about it a lot afterwards, and then I've gone over it again and found things again. So it's a different kind of limud, and it requires that understanding. And it's definitely easier when you have a book.
Yeah.
Okay. The rulership, the dominion of the force of pleasure is in the eternal world. Meaning the whole point of procreating is to be able to get to the world of eternity. And that's the bridge that allows humanity to make it there. So nimtzeit b'shuto, it is to be found in its domain, shel shilton koach hatanug, meaning the ability to approach a reality of eternity stems from the world of eternity. That is ruled by ta'anug. So as you approach that with procreation, you're going to taste some of ta'anug in it because it comes from the dominion of pleasure.
Right.
Okay, that's how he's formulating this. Okay? So, behold, in its domain, we grab pleasure, we understand pleasure as basically the custom of the place that everything is attracted to and everything is pulled after. Okay, so he's saying that specifically when it comes to sexuality, we're considering pleasure a maisa because it is the act that takes us towards eternity, and therefore it has pleasure in it. But the pleasure is that, meaning you're being attracted to you're being pulled to do this maisa because of the pleasure in it. Okay, ve'aken anu omrim ki b'nogea lepulat ha'olada, when it comes to procreation and sexuality, Rachmana kari lahana ma'aseh, the Torah considers pleasure an act. Because it's something, I guess, maybe we'll understand at this point, that it's an act. Why is it an act? That pleasure is what draws you it has a force that brings you to that act, that ultimately that act brings you towards this heightened, this dimension of eternity. Ad kan haya signon hasbara lekoach ma'atido sha'olam. Until now, that was the style of our explanation that we understood from the future of reality, meaning ma'atido sha'olam, from that which is yet to come in the world. Okay, so from the perspective of the future world, from the dominion of pleasure, we can explain it like that. But now let's explain what's going on from this angle, from the point of view of the transient world. There are two things that happened to Adam in Genesis. Nigzar alav mita v'nitgaresh megan eden. This is my lot in life. This is my destiny to constantly be reading these issues. Why would Maamar have anything to do with what we're learning in Alshech? But this is because God said you're going to be teaching and learning these things. Okay. Nigzara alav misa. So death was decreed on Adam. V'nitgaresh megan eden. He was also kicked out of the garden. Harei ki ha'eder hakilayom v'chaye eden. Behold the loss of a life of pleasure and immortality. Bani chada biksa inun. I don't know what that means. I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't remember what this means. Bani chada biksa inan. This is Aramaic. Whatever, I could try to, whatever. Okay, I'll come back to that. V'alkein, and therefore, mikivan shekol ikra shel pulat ha'olada hi hatzala migzeres hakilayon, since the whole idea now that man can perpetuate the species through procreation, it is to get over the decree of destruction, because now he's become mortal. Therefore, the pleasure, this safety, this allowance that we have for him to get over the fact that he's mortal now, it's the same as the pleasure of eternity. Because this is the rule. B'makom chidlon shulton ha'ibadon, sham hi ptichat sharei ha'idon. Wherever you have the loss of the rulership, the dominion of a temporal world, you have more pleasure. Right? Since pleasure is a function, it's in the domain of an eternal world, to the degree that you get out of the constraints of a temporal world, you're approaching pleasure. So since man has the ability now to maintain somehow, even though he's mortal and he's stuck in a temporal world, he can maintain his existence in a way, a touch of eternity. So that approaches towards pleasure. And therefore, when it comes to an act that could create a child, the sages said that the Torah considers pleasure an action. And so too, that is the rule, and that is the characteristic b'ktushata shel haShabbos. Let's bring it back to the sanctity of Shabbos. Ikar haribusa shel haShabbos hu ki hu me'ein shel halamachar b'yitzuma shel hayom. The big, amazing, wonderful thing about Shabbos, the most amazing thing, it is that it is a me'ein, an aspect of the machar, the domain of tomorrow, which is the eternal world, which is the world of pleasure, bi'itzuma shel hayom, smack in the dimension of the today, of action. And therefore, that's why it's so important to abstain, to change your whole modality in terms of action, to create a bubble of a dimension to sustain the Kiddush of Shabbos. And based through what we have discussed in this paragraph, that can explain to us the depth of why the mitzvah of the day of Shabbos is oneg. The oneg Shabbos, because the pleasure of Shabbos, ein sof inyano, there is no end to it. Because in this day, in a temporal world where days come and go, right? The future world is called the day because it's just one day. It never changes, right? But here you have a day of Shabbos, and it's temporal. And yet, so you have the mitzius of oneg in this world, which is totally temporal. However, at the oneg Shabbos means that really a complete revelation of Shabbos and a complete being within Shabbos is total oneg. Really, Shabbos, what Shabbos comes to introduce, really, in its most simplest way, is the reality of oneg. To the point where it has the ability, it's totally separated from this distinction that we made between pleasure and act. That Shabbos itself, in sanctifying the day, by not doing anything, it's considered hana. The hana is considered a maisa. Meaning you're considered doing an act of Shabbos, of remembering the Shabbos, right? By engaged in hana, which normally we say hana is not an act. And yet, the hana here is an act in Shabbos too. It's the same thing.
So in two situations, it's considered an act.
Meaning,
Shabbat and sexual act.
In the forbidden sexual relationships, they say if you had, in the case where you had hana'ah, even if there was no ma'aseh, you are guilty. As opposed to Yael and Sisra, where not only was she passive, but also she did not have any pleasure. And that's why she was okay. Okay, so the pleasure itself is considered an act. Where else do you have that? In Shabbos. Then it says, Zachar Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha. What is Zachar? Zachar sounds like a description, right? It's right, but there are acts that you do, right, that are there to embody pleasure. So you see the connection between the pleasure and the act. Or not meaning just having pleasure in honoring the Shabbos, that is considered an act. Dok heitev b'lashon hamikra la'asos es haShabbos. If you look, it's very interesting. It says, the pasuk says, "V'shomer b'nei Yisrael haShabbos," and the children of Israel should safeguard the Shabbos, la'asos, in order to do. That the safeguarding, not doing, is doing. That you have both the ava and the yira, and the doing and the not doing in both, because you can have a non-act, that the hana itself is the act. Even though Shabbos is considered rest, meaning the non-act, non-changing, non-engaged in change, which is described by the words sitting and not doing, nevertheless, the Torah still characterizes the not doing as a doing, in order to do. And that's just like when the Torah talks about the sexual, forbidden sexual relationships or acts that were done without acts, it still calls it ha'osot, right? Those souls that did, meaning even if they didn't do an act, it was considered that they did an act. Because the Torah equates a certain level of hana, when it's really hana, right, stemming from that spiritual world, it's a masa. Okay. Let's take a break for a second. Okay, any questions? It's all out there, right? It's pretty ethereal.
Yeah.
Okay, uvenakuda zu, that's why I recommend we do each one at least 3 times. Uvenakuda zu, and in this point, genuzahi hashkatas hamias libam shal tovim hanal. In this issue that we just discussed, this is how we can silence those naysayers that had that problem before. How can it be that you can taste an expansion of doing, of getting up and doing a positive mitzvah in the act or the non-act of abstaining from an action and embodying Sheva Atasa to sit and not do. Ki amnam heim advarim. That's the whole point. V'kushta de milsa hachiyava. And the truth is so. Degam isur shel Shabbos nimchanim heim kemim chana ava. Even when you abstain from the things on Shabbos that you're meant to abstain from, the forbidden acts, that is an expression of ahava, of love, not just an expansion of love, not just a constriction of respect and awe. And you only see this expressed really by the forbidden commandments of Shabbos. דמכיוון דמטבע קדושת היום דשבס יוצרס מציאות של הנוח חשיבה מייסה, הלא שפר אנו אומרים כי בחובס הלבבה של שבס מסתלקת היא המחיצה בין הקום ועשה ובין השב ואל תעשה. That since the whole form of the sanctity of the Shabbos day creates a reality that pleasure is considered action, then it's beautiful what we're saying, because in the obligations on the heart of us regarding Shabbos, it leaves the domain of just getting up and doing, it leaves the separation between the domain of getting up and doing and sitting and not doing. So this whole bifurcation, this duality of positive and negative, of Ava and Yira, loses its distinction on Shabbos, and they're both sides are embodiment of each other. To Gidra Shamaisa B'Yom Shabbos, because what constitutes an act in regards to Shabbos, Mishunahu B'Yikra Migidra Shamaisa B'Shesh Yimei Masa, is very different than what constitutes an act during the 6 days of the week. And once we have discarded the differentiation, the separation between proactive deeds and sitting and abstaining, it stands to reason, or it can be understood, that even the commandments of what not to do on Shabbos have within them expressed love of positive acts. The separation of the distinction between being proactive and doing and abstaining and not doing, this distinction that we disregard when it comes to Shabbos, it is included in the statement Zachar v'Shamar b'Dibur Echad Nemru, that the remembering and the safeguarding of Shabbos were said together in one utterance at Sinai. V'havin hetiv, and understand well. So that was all a description of just that element. First of all, remember, we want to understand in the davening why we appeal and supplicate to God to share Shabbos with us in a desirous way, more than once. Why we ask Him for it twice. So I don't know if you can imagine or project where we're going to go with this.
No.
Okay. Should we try another paragraph?
Yeah.
I in Brachos Lamed Daled, the Gemara in Brachos in page 34 says, Amar Rav Yehuda, L'olam al yishal adam sachav, lo b'shalosh rishonos, v'lo b'shalosh achronos, v'lo b'amtzios. I'm sorry, ella b'amtzios. Okay, so when it comes to the structure of Shemona Esrei, it's very important to know as follows. The Shemona Esrei comes in thirds. There's the first third, the last third, and the middle third.
Right.
The first third is always follows this structure. The first third is the first three brachos, right, of Magen Avraham, Mechaya Mesim, Manata Kadosh, that's Avot, and that's always Shevach, that's praise of God. The last three, you always end off with Hamachazir Shchinaso L'Tzion, right, and giving thanks, and Sim Shalom, right, or Shalom, right, Hamavarech L'Tama Yisod B'Shalom, that's always Hodah, right, admittance, thank you, right, okay.
Gratitude.
Right, and exactly, gratitude. And the middle is the place to ask, that's the appropriate place, to ask for the things you're going to ask for. Now on Shabbos and Yom Tov, we don't ask for things, so instead we put in the middle the content that talks about the sanctity of the day. But in a regular Shemona Esrei, you have to have the opening three are praise, the closing three are gratitude, and the middle is the appropriate place to ask for whatever you're asking for. Okay, Rav Chanina, because Rav Chanina said, Rishono, the first blessings, Dome le'eved shemisad shevach lifnei Rabbo. It is, what is it like? It's like a servant who arranges praise before his master. Amtsius Dome le'eved shemevakesh pras mirabbo. The middle blessings where we ask for things, that is where the servant asks for something from his master. Achronos, and the end, the last blessings, it's like somebody who received already that which he asked from his master, so he's thanking him and saying goodbye and parting. Okay, Ukasva Tosfos, and Tosfos over there says, Dira Maskal al Yishal, Pirish Rabbeinu Chananel explains, Rabbeinu Hai Didaf and Rabbeinu Hai, the Hai Gon, Didafka liyachid aval tzarchei tzibur shel. So remember, the beginning of the statement of the Gemara was that a person should never ask for things in Shemona Esrei except for in the middle. So in the end, the Gemara says this is all. Tosfos says that this is all in regards to a personal request, but this is not true in regards to a communal request. V'teda, and you should know, Didafke Yachid Ka'amar Sharei Ikar Brachas Achronas Tzarchei Tzibur Heim Tzarchei Tzibur Heim Akan Lashon HaTosfos Yi'orin Shom. So Tosfos says you should know that specifically when it comes to an individual, right, we mean to say that he should only request things in the middle. Why? Because if you note, Tosfos says that the last three that you're calling gratitude, they are actually requests on the communal level. That's what Tosfos says.
On the communal level.
Think about it.
Sim Shalom.
Hamvarech et Amo Yisrael Bashalom.
Yeah.
That's God maintaining the relationship with His people. But you're still asking for something. Don't tell me it's gratitude. You're asking for, right, Shalom. Right?
And Modim? How would you...
First of all, Hamachazir Shchinatzo L'Tzion. What's the context of that? You're asking Ritzei Hashem Elokeinu. God, you should be desirous of our prayers and our karbanot. Meaning, listen to our prayers. Right? We're asking that you should be desirous, right? We're asking that everybody recognize God. So these are all things we're asking for. Not like the beginning of the Shemona Esrei where we don't ask, we just make statements and we talk about how good God is. Right? So that's what Tosfos is saying. The Pachad Yitzchok says on the face of it, this is very difficult. If you're going to tell me that the last three blessings in every prayer are actually requests for needs, but the only reason why it's okay, it's not a violation of this rule, is because it's requests for the public and not the individual, right? So, imkain, my high damrina begamara ala shlosha achonis tuhu dami bahen le'avet shegil b'pras mirabah v'niftar halachlo. So he says, if what Tosfos is saying is true, how does it make sense for the Gemara? Because the Gemara says, Reb Chanina said, you know what the last three brachos are like? Like the guy who's serving his master, he already got what he's asking for, and now he's thanking him and moving on. Right. Well, then if he's thanking him and moving on, why are you telling me that the last three prayers are actually... Right. Can I trouble you for the tissues, please? Thank you. Okay, so he's asking a good kasha on, thank you, trying to understand Tosfos. Hello, bakashot tzrachim. Behold, is it not that the request for things that you need, the kabbalat pras, and receiving a reward, heim tarti desatri, those are two opposites, those are two mutually exclusive things, right? One is I'm in a state of need, I'm requesting something I don't have, and the other is, I got something. Okay? Mm-hmm. No, not another cliffhanger. Oh no.
You engineer those.
I didn't. I always ask you. And you always tell me, do a little bit more. And I do a little bit more. But now we're in a quagmire because we have a great question.
Yeah.
And we have a very long paragraph answer, which involves a lot of Yiddish. So I'm just telling you that to whet your appetite. Okay? Oh, it's beautiful. I remember this now. Okay, I'm going to take a minute here. Remember, we are talking about the prayer in Shabbos davening, but it's very, very similar to a prayer we make in every Shemona Esrei during the week too. So for next time, I want you to note that the bracha before Modim is that we ask God, right, like we said, we ask God to be desirous of our tefillot and our karbanot. And yet, that is the beginning, like Tosfos, right, like our Gemara, of the last three. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to ask for something, but to actually, why would we characterize it on the one hand as gratitude? Meaning we're not asking, it's not for us, we're giving something to God when we're doing that. Because what's gratitude? Giving something to God, right? So if you characterize that as gratitude, that means that statement should be about that God should have something. And yet, if you're asking for it, right, then from Tosfos' point of view, it's actually a request. Then you're asking for it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we're asking here. But to bring it back, remember that there's two instances. Our original question, the essay, was two instances in the Shabbos Shemona Esrei that we're asking God to be desirous of something, and that our Shabbos should be desirous. So however we understand, we still need to understand in our regular Shemona Esrei, what does it mean that we're asking now that God should be desirous of something? And is that a request for us, or is that a gratitude to Him? That's what we're touching on now, that we're going to get into. And with that, I leave you with a cliffhanger. Baruch Hashem li'olam. Amen v'amen.
Amen. Chazak Baruch.